good afternoon everyone, and I hope you're well, and welcome to another discussion event with the Island of Ireland Contemporary History and Politics Network. We're very happy to be joined by Siobhán Fenton today, and we're going to talk about different aspects of politics in Northern Ireland, or North of Ireland, since 1998. With all our events, we're very grateful to the GW4 network for funding our group and the videos and the events we're able to hold. In terms of introductions, just for myself, so I'm Dr Thomas Leahy. I'm a senior lecturer in British and Irish politics at Cardiff University here in Wales. My primary research area is the conflict in and about Northern Ireland, peace process and politics. More specifically, I research on Irish Republicanism since 1969, and my first book, The Intelligence War Against the IRA, with Cambridge University Press, won the Political Studies Association of Ireland's Brian Farrell Book Prize in 2021. And I'll introduce Siobhán now. So Siobhán Fenton is a writer and political commentator from Belfast. Her 2018 book, The Good Friday Agreement, analyses the impact of the peace agreement on contemporary Northern society. It's a very good book as well, actually, which is on students reading this here. From 2020 to 2024, Siobhán was a senior communications advisor to Sinn Féin in the Oireachtas. She currently writes about Irish and Northern Irish politics for the Irish Times and is a commentator for the BBC and RTÉ. So Siobhán, you're very welcome here at Cardiff today, where we're filming from. Before we get into discussion with Siobhán on different questions, I just thought for anyone who's new to this topic, members of the public we're aware are interested in the content as well, we'll just give you a brief overview of the conflict, peace process and politics in North of Ireland or Northern Ireland, whatever you want to call it. Just be aware with this, as I always caveat before we start, this is generally, most of it, my interpretation. Bits are generally accepted by scholars, but some bits are my interpretation, so just bear that in mind. But it will give you a brief overview of what we're about to discuss. So the conflict commenced in 1969. Although Irish Republicans saw the undemocratic nature of partition by the British government and also Unionist British Protestants from 1920 as a long-term catalyst. And actually, from an Irish Republican and Irish nationalist view in history, this goes long back, if you want to go back to Norman conquest of Ireland. Now, scholars generally agree that the devolved British Protestant Ulster Unionist government in Belfast thereafter, so after 1920 at the time of partition, implemented widespread discrimination against Northern nationalists. That term means Irish nationalists living in North of Ireland or Northern Ireland before 1969. So the civil rights movement emerged in the 1960s, but it met with unionist and state resistance. Intercommunal clashes emerged by 1969 in August, leading to British troops eventually having to enter. However, they, in my view, so this is specifically my view, quickly turned on the Irish nationalist community to prevent a two-front conflict emerging. By 1972, some indiscriminate British security operations saw a sizable minority of Irish Catholics living in the north join a new Irish Republican Army. We'll just call it the IRA from here onwards for simplicity. The IRA and its political wing, Sinn Féin, believed steps towards Irish unity would best achieve equality. Then a peace process emerged if we fast forward to the 1990s. So a peace process emerged inclusive of all sides by the 1990s due to, in my view, a political and military stalemate between all the conflict participants. By 1998, the major parties to the conflict, other than the Democratic Unionist Party, the DUP, signed the 1998 Good Friday Peace Agreement. Implemented quite a few different things, some of this we'll touch on today. Implemented power sharing, started police reform, paramilitary prisoners were released, and more things as well. So in politics today, you have five main parties, and I'm sure they'll come up in the discussion. So just to introduce the different parties. So you have Sinn Féin, the Irish Republican All-Ireland Party, who seek Irish unification. Currently, Sinn Féin topped the last Northern Ireland Assembly election in 2022, topped the poll. Then in second in that poll in 2022 is the Democratic Unionist Party, the DUP. Quite simply, the DUP's main ambition is to keep Northern Ireland British and keep it within the United Kingdom. Also, the Unionist Party, the UUP, want the same thing. They're now the Junior Unionist Party. I can't remember off the top of my head where they finished in the last election, so I apologise for that. But they want the same thing, to keep Northern Ireland British. But we'll probably touch a little bit today in different events about the difference between the DUP and UUP, because there are differences. Next up then is something called the SDLP, which stands for Social Democratic and Labour Party. So the SDLP ultimately do want Irish unification or reunification, probably more in the more medium term than Sinn Féin. Now that might have changed in recent years, but certainly during the conflict, that would have been a difference between them. And the SDLP didn't support the IRA's campaign. That was a significant difference between them and Sinn Féin. And then the last party we'll talk about primarily in this little introduction is the Alliance parties. The Alliance Party essentially, sometimes I say to students, a bit like Liberal Democrats for Northern Ireland, but in this case, what makes them unique is they're not unionist and are not a nationalist party, so they won't affiliate with Irish nationalism or Ulster unionism. So they claim to be agnostic on the Irish unity question. So that's the main kind of actors we'll be looking at and a brief background to the conflict. Then getting into discussion questions. So the first for Siobhán, the study very welcome here at Cardiff. Could you just give us a sense, about your own background and experience of conflict/peace process, maybe that you might have just been coming across also in your work?
So thanks very much for having me here today. It's really great to be part of this discussion. It was my engagement with the peace process would be from two different perspectives. Mainly one would be working as a journalist for many years, mainly reporting on and covering post-conflict society in the north of Ireland. So that would be often for the BBC, the Guardian and the New Statesman political magazine, often explaining to mainly a British audience what life is like in contemporary society in the north and the many ways in which it can sometimes be perhaps missed elsewhere, in Britain, how society continues to still be affected by the conflict, even though it has ended so long ago now, but it continues to affect everything from the healthcare system to education to rates of mental health and different issues around justice and policing. So I would have reported on that for many years, and then from 2020 to 2024, as I said, I worked for Sinn Féin, the largest political party in Ireland, in the Oireachtas Parliament, so the Parliament in Dublin. So I might have a bit of experience then as well, just from seeing what it's like within a political party, I suppose, in terms of the nuts and bolts of the day-to-day reality of how politics is made. So a bit of experience of looking at it, analysing it from the outside, and then a wee bit from the inside as well.
Okay, that's interesting. And just to follow up on that, because I'm interested in this for your journalist background. So you engage with lots of different journalist outlets. Do you notice if you're working with journalist outlets in Northern Ireland, maybe the obvious answer to this is yes. I'm sure if I asked my colleagues in Wales, they'd say the same. And compared to more, in this case, Dublin-based or London-based or from abroad, different newspapers, do you get that sense that there's quite a different set of knowledge amongst those different newspapers about the conflict and the peace process and what's happening in politics in Northern Ireland today?
I think so, absolutely. So I think that was most acutely shown during the Brexit referendum. So I would have been working as a social affairs correspondent for the Independent in London at the time, and I remember whenever there was this discussion taking place about the referendum, and I remember going to my editor on the news desk at the time and thinking, and saying to him, this isn't compatible with the Good Friday Agreement. If this happens, if the UK leaves the EU, and it was the first time that particularly for even the political staff who would have covered Westminster politics, that would have occurred to them, and trying to explain that at the time. And I would have written quite a bit in the year of the Brexit referendum about the fact that this could be a massive issue, the Good Friday Agreement, in terms of Brexit negotiations. And I think at the time a lot of people thought it was maybe a bit of a niche issue or something that could be overcome, or it was a sort of a sideline issue, but something that happened over there in Ireland and wouldn't be relevant. And then we saw in lots of agonising detail how much the Good Friday Agreement became so central to those Brexit negotiations. I think people hadn't expected it at all. So I think, but certainly if there's almost one good thing over the course of the last few years, I think there's been much more of awareness of how little, perhaps among people in Britain themselves, how little they maybe knew about the Good Friday Agreement and the peace process. And I do find, generally speaking, people are quite keen to learn once they know that it is an important issue. And I always find, and often it's particularly in Scotland and Wales in particular, given Scottish and Welsh people's own experiences of devolution, and some of the similarities and differences around protection for minority language rights as well. There's a particular interest there. So it's always really interesting to hear kind of outside perspectives from people outside of the North as well about the Good Friday Agreement.
Yeah, great, yeah, and super interesting. So, right, so I thought what we'll try and do is start basically chronologically, which I think will help the audience try to get some good understanding on different perspectives of things that have happened since 1998. So if we start with the Good Friday Agreement itself, if you were looking at it, which parts do you feel have been, we'll start with benefits to begin with, like what has been beneficial for society, do you feel, that's come out of the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland?
Yes, I suppose the kind of core tenet of it, the most sort of undeniable success of the Good Friday Agreement has been the end of the conflict, so the kind of day-to-day violence and bloodshed which would have engulfed society in the North for it was the guts of 3 decades. So the fact that generations now growing up in the North don't have to have the same fears that their parents and grandparents would have had about even just leaving the house day to day, and the complete devastation that was taking place in society at that time. So the fact that there isn't that day-to-day conflict is obviously the kind of core component of that. But I think at the same time, it wouldn't perhaps be possible to say that the North is a completely normal society, going back to as if the conflict hadn't happened. So there are lots of ways that the kind of post-conflict life tends to be very different compared to if you were living in Glasgow or Cardiff. So it was one of the main things is that the fact that there is still a deeply segregated society. So I think it's still the case that only about 8% of children are educated in integrated education settings. So that's with children from the Protestant and Catholic communities educated together side by side. It's still the case that kind of what are called mixed marriages, so marriages between people in the different communities, are still very, very much in the minority. And there tends not to be so much kind of mixing even socially, and there's about 9 out of 10 people who live in social housing live in a community that is all kind of one community or another. There's very little that's kind of mixed. So I think sometimes people will talk about there being a kind of a benign peace, so to speak, or kind of a passive peace, so that there isn't the kind of presence of day-to-day conflict there, but at the same time it's not a fully integrated kind of politically healthy society in which people would intermingle and have friends and colleagues or classmates from across the full spectrum of society.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. And so then the second part of this, which you can probably guess, is do you think there's any parts of the Good Friday Agreement, and your book talks about this in detail, that you look back and you feel, and now with the Advantage viewpoint from 2025, that are unfulfilled or just needed greater work in the first place? So any parts of the agreement that you feel need further work, or they're just unfulfilled and they haven't been implemented?
Yes, absolutely. There would be need for much more integration day to day as well. And I think one of the other kind of major flaws in the Good Friday Agreement itself would have been that how human rights would have been considered at the time would have been perhaps defined in a way that was very specific to society in 1998. So it was not really considered to be the case that perhaps now we would see more of an emphasis on the rights for the LGBT community and for women's rights, whereas it was, I think, as human rights would have been kind of conceptualised at that time, it was more within the idea sometimes of the right to express your cultural identity as being British or Irish, which of course is important in terms of the agreement. But I think particularly feminists in the North would have experienced a very long and hard-fought fight to have abortion rights, and I think there was a huge amount of frustration that just obviously the North for many years had one of the most restrictive kind of pieces of legislation in terms of abortion rights access, and that was despite the fact that it was routinely ruled even by the Supreme Court in Britain as being a breach of human rights, and yet the Good Friday Agreement it didn't seem to be able to kind of vindicate those rights for women. It was, I think a lot of people would have felt frustration that human rights had been defined into too narrow a term, and that perhaps as society changed and had become more progressive since 1998, that there was that framework wasn't able to apply in the same way. Although it should be pointed out that those the abortion laws have been changed by Westminster ultimately, but I think there would be concern, particularly among people, that as our ideas of human rights continues to evolve and to change and hopefully become more progressive, that if we are relying on a kind of a framework which is from 1998, that it is kind of struggling to keep pace in society with these changes.
Okay, that's interesting. And just, so this is a follow-up to this, and if you have any thoughts on, I'm thinking actually just partly because our students have questions related to this at the moment in some of their assignments, and it asks about like specifically about power sharing. I mean, we'll get more into that in a second, but if we were looking, say at this stage, you're looking at progress since 1998, now you can totally disagree with me on this, but to give you an idea, when we discuss this with students, I mean, we see the difference with some scholars and authors is that they'll have quite a what I call like a maximalist view, so they expect it shouldn't just be the end of conflict and kind of muddling along, it should be persistent and integrated society, some of the things we were talking about. Whereas other scholars, I have to say more what I would opt into is to say, look, the key thing is about, did it help usher an end to the conflict, which I think it did. But that doesn't mean I don't think there's some difficulties, but that's different than saying, if that makes sense, power sharing itself shouldn't happen because it keeps people divided. Anyway, so do you have any thoughts on that, about like that debate, and whether, and I guess the central question there is, do you think power sharing generally, when you look back, has made some progress for society in the North?
Yes, I think definitely power sharing has made a lot of progress, and we're in many ways kind of unrecognisable society now, even compared to 10 years ago, kind of never mind 20 years ago, and all of that progress is has to be very much cherished and not taken for granted at all. But I think it's really interesting aspect that I think perhaps attitudes depend a lot on the kind of generation you're from in the North, and I think I would have been 5 years old when the Good Friday Agreement was signed myself, and so I think for lots of people in my generation there's a certain amount of impatience to kind of continue to progress society, and there's a sense that or perhaps for parents and grandparents that they maybe feel more a sense that people should just be happy with what they have now. But I think for younger people there's a desire to kind of keep pushing on and to not just be grateful that the conflict has ended, but to be pushing for a more equal and more integrated society. And I think that particularly for kind of even younger people now who would have been born long after the Good Friday Agreement, or even after the St Andrews Agreement, there's much more impatience to not just kind of be grateful for the conflict being over, but to say, at what point can we start to demand much more progress and to see kind of genuine change and progress there.
Yeah, that's interesting, and certainly like my giving away age is the same. I was about the same age at the same time. What's interesting with that, actually, just reflecting on that, because we're in Wales, and chatting to people here, like I grew up in South East England with family, I do remember it being on the news, and it was quite a big thing, and I remember an assembly at my primary school, it was discussed, and then friends I chat to here about the same age as me remember that as well, which is interesting when you then think, that's kind of the only thing we heard about it, but it was kind of, mentioned to us, even at primary school age, so it is interesting. Right, okay, so we'll break this down then essentially into the little different time periods before we have a look potentially at the future, which academics always get told off for if you start trying to predict the future, but yeah. So, power sharing, so essentially it doesn't exist then essentially till late 1999. And then goes up to 2002, and then there's a kind of a permanent collapse from there. And then it doesn't come back then until 2006 and 2007. In your perspective, why do you think that was the case? Why was power sharing so unstable until 2006, 2007?
So I think it's perhaps because it could be quite complex and a range of reasons, but that people were, particularly the politicians involved, were very nervous about, I suppose it was at that time such an alien and unknown kind of concept for them, so I think there would have been a certain amount of reticence at that time, and I think particularly around that kind of most kind of prolonged collapse, which would have ended after the signing of the St Andrews Agreement. I think a deep sense still of mistrust among the political parties. I think especially around that time, whenever I think Sinn Féin had a number of controversies around whether, I think it was questioned whether their support for kind of policing and the justice system was as authentic as they were perhaps saying externally as what was happening internally. And then I think particularly once you had, it was a very unusual thing that seemed to happen within society in the North, which was that as perhaps society was becoming more moderate in terms of the fact that the conflict had ended, then voters wanted to actually go for kind of more hardline politicians who were going to go in to those democratic institutions and still have the same kind of vigour and, kind of very colourful politics, and to be seen to be much more hardline in terms of what they represented. So then that was then whenever voters had turned more to Sinn Féin and the DUP as opposed to the more moderate kind of SDLP and UUP. But then I say that brought its own challenges, because as we've seen, not just on the time of the Statesman agreement, but power sharing has collapsed so many times now in the north. So they had most recently a very long period between, I think it was 2017 until 2020 initially. Sinn Féin had collapsed the institutions in protest about what was called the cash for ash scandal around a kind of a green energy scheme which had been mishandled by a DUP minister. But then as that kind of row went on and on and on, it became about so much more, as everything tends to in the north. So then it became much more about Brexit, and then also even the status of the Irish language is a bit of a proxy around how the kind of nationalist community thought they were being treated compared to the unionist community. And then once the institutions had only just about come back again then, and then it was then just back for about 2 years before they were pulled down again, this time by the DUP to protest about the kind of Brexit, kind of how that deal had played out, to protest about that. And then I think it's only we just passed the 1 year anniversary of the institutions being back again. But I wouldn't want to be a pessimist, but I think a lot of people would be. I don't know if I could say with 100% certainty even this day next year that the institutions would still be there, because there's so much kind of volatility there, and it's compared to, as I say, the institutions in Wales or in Scotland or in Westminster, there is a certain kind of dynamic there, partly because we have this mandatory coalition between the unionists and nationalist politicians there. So of course, as your students will know, that means that if one party decides that they're not going to be as part of that power sharing institutions, and that they kind of automatically fall down, and there just isn't a government there at Stormont. So it is that I think was essential at the time of the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, in order to ensure that there was buy-in from both communities there. But it definitely is one of the kind of vulnerabilities, or some might say it as a flaw of the Good Friday Agreement, the fact that there is that mandatory coalition. It means it results in the institutions can often be there but very quickly fold as soon as a crisis kind of seems to catch hold at Stormont.
Okay, that's interesting. And it's interesting the point you said, yes, related to people having to get used to that form of government. And it's quite a good point, because because of, which I've made clear here, is my view would be similar to yours, that, this is kind of work in progress, and it is a transition from a conflict. So it's totally different when we had the Senate set up here or in Holyrood in Scotland. But also, I say to students, I think if we tried to get all the parties in Cardiff Bay to share power, I'm not certain that would be smooth sailing either. And particularly, again, if one pulled out, the whole government collapsed. And probably this, I don't know enough about Scottish politics, but I imagine it's probably the same. So it's a really interesting point. Right, so then the next question is about the St Andrews Agreement. So it's signed in 2006, and power sharing commenced, led by the DUP, and Sinn Féin commences 2007, top of my head. And then it goes on for 10 years, essentially. So then it's a kind of reverse of what we talked about. Why was that possible? What do you think from, I guess there's maybe part A, part B to this, is why did we end up with the St Andrews Agreement? And then the second part is, it seems to work fairly smoothly then for 10 years. So why do you think that was the case?
Yes, it is really interesting, particularly now looking back, where we have had that period of volatility. More recently, why it was the case that much closer to the conflict, that the parties were able to get on much better during that period after the St Andrews Agreement. And I think I do wonder if it's, to a certain extent, there was a sense that kind of public patience was wearing thin with politicians, particularly after such a prolonged kind of collapse. So there was so much pressure there on the parties to kind of just get on with things, and to show that they could actually get things done, and particularly as those were seen as perhaps untested parties, because they were the more hardline parties. So there was a certain amount of pressure for them to show that they could actually be involved in those kind of day-to-day democratic institutions, rather than risk going to the electorate again for another election cycle and saying, I think that there maybe would have been a risk, perhaps DUP voters would have perhaps said, will we go back to voting UUP then? If it's the difference is having no government at all, or perhaps government under the UUP. So I do wonder if it was kind of pragmatism on behalf of those the politicians, just to actually deliver kind of day-to-day politics. And I think there was a real appetite at that time to see the kind of normalisation of society in the north, and particularly because the education system, the healthcare system, even the kind of infrastructure, the quality of the roads, there was a sense of just there'd been so much underinvestment for so long in the north, and the fact that the Westminster government wouldn't really necessarily, particularly prior to devolution, have kind of shown that much interest, shall we say, in terms of the day-to-day running of what was sometimes be called bread and butter issues, so kind of kind of identity-based issues, but just people wanting to be able to see their GP when they want to make an appointment, or see their dentist for the child to get a place at school, or the child has perhaps additional needs for them to be able to get the support that they should be entitled to. So I think those are real appetite for seen as kind of delivery on normal political issues, or what would be normal maybe perhaps in the rest of Ireland or in Britain at that time.
Yeah. Okay, interesting. So the next question is, as we said, we go up to 2017. I think it was the collapse, isn't it? We said, yeah. And then we get to Brexit, and then we get further collapses after that. So arguably then power sharing, really, I think you're right, up to, I didn't know it was the year anniversary, but I remember it was in 2024 last year. And power sharing's been up and down really, essentially since 2017. Why do you feel that was the case? Is it, would I be right pointing out Brexit, or do you think actually is Brexit and other things alongside that have equally been important that led to power sharing being up and down since 2017?
Yes, I do think that Brexit was definitely a really important part of it. I think we would have even seen within politics at Westminster a real sense of polarisation around that particular issue. So I think, bearing in mind, there's so much kind of hostility often inherent in kind of political discussions in the north. Anyway, whenever you bring in such a decisive or such a divisive issue as Brexit, that tends to kind of amplify hostility and tensions between the parties that were existing there anyway, on a much kind of much more intense way. And so I think that it would have been very difficult for the institutions to be operating while you had those kind of debates around Brexit. But I think another aspect of it as well would have been, I think, particularly among some people in the nationalist community, and often among voters of Sinn Féin, a certain element of frustration with their kind of with the role that Sinn Féin was playing at Stormont, and perhaps sort of a sense that they'd had at that stage, for a decade, ministers from Sinn Féin involved centrally at Stormont, but a sense that for nationalist and Republican communities and voters that there wasn't been enough progress that they were actually seeing in their day-to-day lives. So we still have extremely high rates of poverty and deprivation in the north, oftentimes, particularly among nationalist communities. So I think there was a lot of pressure there, particularly where Sinn Féin voters would have been saying to their representatives, what are we really getting out of devolution and power sharing? There would have been the sense that there was perhaps kind of government for government's sake, and that there wasn't enough benefits for people outside of the kind of politics with a capital P. So I think that would have been one of the other issues that would have been kind of behind that collapse at the time. But as I say, kind of fueled by Brexit, which made it so much harder for any political parties to be seen to compromise on anything at all, whether it's at Westminster or at Stormont. So I think that's partly why there was such a prolonged collapse across the full kind of 3 years at that stage.
Okay, could I just ask a follow-up there, because I'm interested, that's interesting, the details of the nationalist community, and those other factors are having an influence on their overall verdict of what they're seeing is happening with power sharing. If we look at that like vice versa with unionism, and this I think will be something we'll discuss in a later session as well, is trying to get our heads around, what was the DUP's strategy, particularly when they have that confidence supply agreement with Theresa May in London. And from what I saw, I thought, well, they obviously want a hard Brexit and a hard border, because if they reject Theresa May's deal, then you must want a hard border, because otherwise I can't see what the alternative would have been. But my question there is, the way I think, and they had quite a hard negotiating approach, which we see set up in Jonathan Powell's book, for audience used to be chief negotiator for Tony Blair, chief of staff in Northern Ireland. I mean, he said, the DUP and Sinn Féin, he's considered, I think he's like serial negotiators, so they'll try and get as much as they can and might go to the wire for that, to partly try and get benefits for their communities. Now, but what I'm interested to see there is, when you said like with community pressure on nationalism, if we reverse that and look at unionism, and this is partly just for my thinking ahead to get my head around it, is that why the DUP took the approach they did with Brexit? Were they getting pressure from kind of British Protestant unionist voters who would typically back the DUP, and some of the new people, if you like, after the early 2001 when they overtake the UUP? Does that make sense? I'm just trying to get a sense of why was there community pressure on the DUP? Is that why they took the approach they did over Brexit, quite a hardline approach in your view?
So I think that, it's a really interesting kind of proposition to consider, because I do think that the DUP supported Brexit because I think it very much fits with their ideology to be kind of, broadly speaking, opposed to European integration. And I think, to be frank as well, among some of their members, and even I think some of their MPs have hinted at this at various stages, that they wouldn't exactly have been opposed to a hard border on the island of Ireland. I think that some comments from Ian Paisley, Junior, one of the MPs at the time, who's since lost the seat, there would have been a sense that it would have been kind of putting even more distance between the north and the south of Ireland, and that would have very much suited their ideology. But I think it was, as was kind of shown very starkly over the Brexit negotiations, it just wasn't possible to square that circle with also then having kind of links, the same level of access to the British market and the same kind of unfettered free trade. And I think that was then what obviously became impossible for the DUP to really kind of resolve that. I think they kind of backed themselves into a bit of a corner where they had, said that they absolutely wouldn't compromise on so many things, which it wasn't possible for them to deliver all of those, because oftentimes they were quite antithetical to each other. And I do wonder if there's perhaps then, there was subsequently the kind of Windsor framework, which was designed to kind of modify some of those elements of Brexit that the DUP were opposed to. But I think there perhaps is a general sense from the DUP that they just kind of had realised that Brexit wasn't working out for them as a kind of political moment, particularly by around 2022, and they almost just kind of wanted to just move on and just try and talk about other issues, because they realised that it couldn't be something that they would kind of be able to either kind of claim that they'd won in a very compelling or convincing way, but also they realised it was kind of poor ground for them to be fighting on politically. So I think they were quite keen just to kind of move on to other issues. But I do wonder as well, because obviously we might kind of touch on it later, but obviously one of the outworkings of kind of after the Brexit vote was the fact that the DUP then became the holders of the Deputy First Minister position rather than the First Minister position, which then went to Sinn Féin for the first time. And I think since then it's been really interesting. There seems to be a bit of a strategic shift within the DUP whereby they're trying to kind of just get along day by day and focus much more on the kind of delivering those bread and butter issues for their voters, rather than, I think, perhaps having kind of had their fingers burnt with Brexit or those kind of big picture ideological issues. They're trying to focus much more on the cost of living, the price of childcare in the north, or it's like being able to access their GP. Whenever you see DUP MLAs speaking at Stormont, it's much more often on those issues these days rather than identity issues. So I do wonder if that's a bit of a strategic shift for them, and perhaps if there's a bit of a sense, maybe they're getting feedback from their own voters that they don't feel that Stormont is delivering for them enough in their day-to-day lives.
Okay, that's really interesting. And with that, do you, maybe this is me jumping ahead, putting the two together, do you think, because, I mean, the polls over, which is kind of partly with our last question, if there was to be a unification or reunification referendum, or border poll, some people call it, it has gone up slightly for the people who say yes since Brexit. We can see that in polls. Do you think that would have been in the DUP's thinking, that I guess partly because of me as well, my thinking was, if the North doesn't work and power sharing's down, how can you make a compelling case to say, for the swing voters, and maybe people like Alliance, or maybe kind of, people like soft unionists, how can you convince them towards your viewpoint if it doesn't work? And there's, as you said, multiple issues, partly because power sharing's up and down. Do you think that would the wider spectre, I guess, of potential unification and polls, do you think that would have had an impact on DUP? Or is it more, as you said, it's just day-to-day things their constituents are bringing up, saying you've got to get to grips with this, etc.?
I think that's a really interesting aspect of it as well, and I think that's probably played quite a big part for the DUP strategically, because I think, as you say, they kind of end up in a bit of a bind, because if they're saying that it is possible for kind of the Northern Ireland as an entity in this, and it's been a success and it can continue in its current form, but at the same time it's not able to have a functioning government for such long periods. I think particularly for some kind of moderate unionist voters or alliance voters, and to younger generations who are turning 18 and registering to vote, that they might be more likely to say, perhaps we do need to look to Dublin and to look to reunification, because if it's perhaps the perception that partition hasn't worked and the idea of the kind of Northern Ireland state hasn't worked. And I think it's quite interesting as well, though I think within Sinn Féin they also have a lot invested in making kind of Stormont work, because I think sometimes it can be an accusation that unionist voters, not in the DUP, will say that Sinn Féin don't want Northern Ireland to work, and so it's in their interest to keep the institutions down. But I think there's particularly an awareness within Sinn Féin that if there is a border poll on the horizon, perhaps in 5 to 10 years, then it's in nationalist interest and in Republicans' interest for the institutions to be up at Stormont in order to see a kind of a safe and a smooth transference of, I suppose, in terms of how those jurisdictions would be integrated. It wouldn't be in Sinn Féin's interest either for Stormont to be collapsed for a long period of time and then for border poll to be held, in terms of that being a kind of a managed and orderly process. So I think for both the DUP and Sinn Féin, that there's a greater awareness that it's in both their interests for the institutions to be seen to work.
Okay, that's really interesting. Touching on Sinn Féin, so 2022, they become the largest party in the North for the first time. Why did you feel that happened? What was going on electorally that enabled Sinn Féin to finish first place?
Yes, so there'd be a few different reasons. I think one of them would be what is sometimes called the demographic shift in the North. So that would be just the overall demographics between the communities, the unionist community and the nationalist community. It tends to be that the nationalist community that's becoming larger, this would just not be then reflected in the vote share. But as well, I think there was a sense of, particularly because it looked like it was kind of, it appeared that it was a close thing that could happen, that Sinn Féin could take that position. I think lots of nationalist voters kind of rallied around Sinn Féin because they saw that as such an important symbol. Obviously the state of the Northern Ireland state had been designed specifically to ensure something like that would never happen, that an Irish Republican could be the first minister. And so I do wonder if perhaps some kind of moderate, even kind of SDLP voters or people who would have also backed, there's a much smaller kind of hard left party, people before profit, that some of their voters might have then kind of coalesced around their Sinn Féin candidate to try and achieve that as a big symbol. And then as well, because I think a lot of the kind of unionist votes seem to be split at that time. So you would have seen the traditional unionist voice would have been a more kind of a hardline loyalist grouping, and they've kind of made some gains recently, partly because they've been quite vociferous in calling out the DUP about Brexit. So the most kind of high-profile politician, Jim Allister, became an MP and took what had previously been the DUP MP, Ian Paisley Jr.'s seat in the most recent Westminster election. And there's a bit of a sense that perhaps the unionist vote is more fractured compared to the nationalist vote is kind of coalescing much more around Sinn Féin. I think that was perhaps part then of why it's like that Sinn Féin were able to take that position for the first time. And also we would have seen what would have been quite rare within politics in the North as well, which was an almost kind of presidential style campaign. So it was people were talking about that they're going to vote for Michelle, referring to Michelle O'Neill, who became the first minister, even if she wasn't running in their constituency, because it was kind of this idea people were uniting around that broader symbol. So often within the North, people obviously vote much more on ideas, because it's such a polarised society. Ideologically, it's very rare. You wouldn't really see the DUP kind of campaigning the same about voting for Emma in terms of Emma O'Pengelly, the Deputy First Minister. So I think it was a bit of an experiment as well, and Sinn Féin side kind of pushing the kind of the person and the personality much more than the ideology, and it seemed to be successful as well in terms of the eventual vote.
Okay. Yeah. And then one of the penultimate questions, I have a few more actually, if that's okay. In the next decade, where do you see North of Ireland's or Northern Ireland's political future heading? What do you think? And some of that is even if you're seeing there might be various options. What might those options be, do you think, in the next decade or so?
Yes, I think that if it was in the more medium term, so the next kind of 5 to 10 years, one of the most interesting things that could happen is just seeing what happens with the kind of surge of the Alliance Party, who you mentioned in your introduction there, would be seen as the kind of more, it was a bit of a sister party to the kind of Liberal Democrats. And they've definitely seen so much more kind of support grow, particularly among younger voters. And whether they continued to rise, because as we kind of mentioned, there's so much of the institutions at Stormont are based on people who are registered as either kind of nationalist or unionist politicians, whereas Alliance politicians tend to register as neither. And so it could be a really interesting thing to see that if it happens to be the case that you perhaps have the largest political party might be nationalist and the second largest party might identify as neither, and then what does that mean for the institutions there? So I think that'll be a really interesting thing to watch play out. And then I guess as in the kind of medium to longer term, what will happen then in terms of calls for a border poll and whether there's a referendum on Irish unity. And I think it's been really interesting to see Micheál Martin, the current Taoiseach from the Fianna Fáil party, has over the last few years really developed what he's called the Shared Ireland unit, and so that's been about making a number of quite non-controversial kind of steps towards what could be perceived as greater integration. So small kind of infrastructure projects around perhaps a bridge in a particular community linking different groups in the north, which is kind of seen by some unionists as a bit of a overreach in terms of the Republic investing financially in the north, but is often not seen as too controversial compared to other steps that they could take. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in terms of as politicians in Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael kind of dipping their toe into making more gestures like that, and perhaps towards greater planning for Irish unity. And I know one thing that's often talked about is the idea of potentially a citizens' assembly on a united Ireland, and whether that could take place, and whether that ultimately shapes the discussion and potential timing of a border poll as well.
Okay, that's interesting. Just a couple of extra questions. Your observations with the Alliance Party and their rise. I mean, from your perspective, partly I guess, where's that come from? Do you get the sense when we get to the next Assembly election that might continue, or is there potentially a plateau? So just your thoughts about Alliance's rise and then where that might go from here.
So I think it's been really interesting to see that rise, and I think it's partly because they've kind of captured a real appetite, particularly among kind of younger voters who maybe would have had parents who voted for unionist parties, but they perhaps don't see the same kind of affinity or pull to those parties. And I think partly one of the things that has fueled the rise of the Alliance Party would have been some of the very socially conservative values on display within political unionism, which wouldn't reflect, broadly speaking, actual unionists in unionist communities themselves. So I think one of the kind of real things whenever I would talk to kind of my friends in unionist communities would be perhaps just some of the rhetoric that the DUP previously would have used around the LGBT community would mean that for them they just feel that they couldn't ever vote for any DUP politician, and that would have been perhaps the catalyst for them, considering the Alliance Party. But it has been really noticeable that the DUP, as I say, partly because they've been focusing on those more bread and butter issues. I do wonder if that's also part of the DUP strategy to kind of stay away from what they now realise are very polarising kind of attitudes that perhaps linked to their kind of religious roots, and that perhaps are much less likely to kind of comment on those sorts of issues, perhaps to try and appeal to people who they would have really alienated in the past. I think that's one aspect of it. So it'll be really interesting to see in the next Assembly election if the Alliance Party continue that rise. But I do think personally that there would be a bit of vulnerability for the Alliance Party as well, in that I think because they've been such a small and perhaps kind of fringe group for so long, I always find it quite interesting that there isn't really the same level of scrutiny or analysis of their policies, even in terms of in the media in the north. So because it is so unusual for them to be kind of neutral or agnostic on the constitutional question, that tends to be where most of their focus is, whereas there's much less focus on their economic policies. And I think because they are the kind of centrist, kind of Liberal Democrat party, whereas particularly on economic issues, people in the north tend to be much more left-wing. I do wonder if perhaps it's kind of there would be more scrutiny around some of their kind of stances and non-constitutional issues. Could be interesting to see whether that then causes issues for them, because they're trying to attract such a broad church by being kind of say neutral on the kind of orange and green question. But I would imagine not all of their voters necessarily would be as aware of the exact ins and outs of their kind of stance maybe on healthcare, on economic issues, or on social security as well. So that could be an interesting one to watch if once they continue to rise, there's perhaps a bit more scrutiny of those policies and then potential drop off at a certain point.
Sure, definitely. And a follow-up question related to that is about if you mentioned the thing about if there wasn't mandatory power sharing anymore. And, obviously what's interesting with this is something, we don't really know what the DUP's viewpoint exactly was related to exactly why did they not sign a Good Friday Agreement. They said it was the prisoner release and the decommissioning. But certainly, for students who discuss this and academics looking at it, be debates on this, of course. But you could say, well, they weren't in favour of power sharing either in the 70s and 80s and arguably in the 90s. They didn't like the North-South Council because they saw it as like foreign interference, as they said it was. But what I'm asking there is, so we saw in those years, they used to say we should have a voluntary coalition, which probably I'm guessing would have been Biteback Sinn Féin. If you fast forward to now, because as you said, the demographics and the electoral statistics are really different and electoral results. And what's interesting in this debate, like academically, there are some academics who argue this and say this should be done because it might get more consensus in government and get things moving alongside constitutional debates, but in other areas, as we spoke about today, like socioeconomics, etc. But there's others would say, but we tried this essentially in 1974, different demographics, different time, it doesn't work. If you leave out what we can call radical parties, they have a reason then to make the government unworkable via the parliamentary institution. Yeah, so I guess my question on that is, if that debate does arise and say Alliance did move into second place at any point, do you think a kind of voluntary coalition government framework would work in Northern Ireland? Or for the reasons we said, again, some academics saying if you leave certain parties out, so probably at the moment it might be the DUP, certainly from the past few years, looking at other parties' attitudes. Do you think that's actually workable in principle? Yes, just your thoughts about that.
Yes, I think in reality, when it comes down to it, I think the DUP and Sinn Féin wouldn't allow that to happen because it wouldn't be in their interest. So I think that they wouldn't agree to any kind of renegotiation of that. And I suppose as well, if there was going to be a renegotiation of such a fundamental plank, there would need to be some way of trying to give that legitimacy. So I would wonder if that would need to go to another referendum, perhaps, which would be incredibly controversial. I think all the parties and the British and Irish governments would be very nervous about that. Or if there'd be another way of kind of measuring that. So I think it would be seen as too controversial and not suppose kind of benefiting the needs of the main people who'd be making that decision. So I think it's a really interesting thing, but I think in reality it probably wouldn't happen. So but I do wonder if it would be the case that you maybe have a deputy first minister and the first minister from the kind of largest unionist and largest nationalist party, but then lots of Alliance Party ministers around the table. Or would there be the idea that they'd get extra ministers in that sense, or else perhaps, but you could argue that by the time we reach a point as a society where there's so many moderate voters who are voting Alliance, then perhaps there would also be an appetite for a border poll. So perhaps at that stage the British Secretary of State might kind of call the referendum at that stage before it would get to that point. But I think it's a really interesting one, and perhaps something that wouldn't have been foreseen back in 1998. Well, one, the idea that a Republican would be the first minister, but even the sheer prospect that a unionist wouldn't be in either of those kind of two top positions would have been just completely unthinkable when you think about the kind of position of strength that political unionism would have had at that time, and particularly the Ulster Unionist Party would have had the position, I think, would have been called Prime Minister of Northern Ireland as dormant for so many generations. So it's been a huge kind of shift in quite a short period of time.
Great. And then just the last question I was interested in asking, if it works for you, is about conflict legacy, because obviously since 1998 nothing really happened to begin with, or there were some ideas that were disagreed from different sides, including British and Irish governments at times as well. So we have the Stormont House Agreement in 2014, from the top of my head, that looks like a way forward. Then we get kind of rumblings at the end of Theresa May's government that go into Boris Johnson's of there might be in my view, in all but name is just an Amnesty Act. And then also basically from, interestingly, March 2020, when COVID kicks in, this starts to trundle as an idea through Parliament with the Conservatives in power. Then obviously we get the Act with the Conservatives passed. And so we're at the stage now where Labour has essentially said we're not having unconditional amnesties, but and this is partly for my benefit, but also we seem to be in a kind of stasis period now where they've maintained bits of the previous Legacy Act, but we're not too sure exactly what the British government's going to do going forward. So if you have any thoughts at where we're at with Legacy, and do you see any pathway forward that you agreed to have any kind of formal mechanisms laid down to try and deal with conflict legacy?
Yeah, so I think personally speaking, I don't think that there ever will be any kind of proper or appropriate mechanism in place for kind of dealing with those kind of legacy issues or unsolved or unprosecuted cases from the conflict. And I think it's one of the things that really I found I was really affected by, even being a journalist reporting on lots of those cases. I would have been in court for many of those, including there was the Ballymurphy massacre, and I was really struck by just on a day-to-day basis how incredibly hard it is for the families and the survivors affected, who are, even as we speak now, I'm sure will be at various kind of courtrooms across the north and going and sitting for these incredibly emotionally very difficult trials where they're hearing really distressing material, being told about obviously their loved ones' last moments. And it's something that as a journalist I would have before then kind of been much more familiar with these kind of broader hypothetical or philosophical conversations around people discussing around people getting an amnesty or not. And I think as I was just really struck by how many families are affected by that, and it oftentimes would be communities here now, their relatives would be quite elderly, they're often communities that would be very disenfranchised in terms of they wouldn't have had kind of education opportunities and wouldn't have the resources to be able to employ very expensive legal teams. And definitely the impression I would get from having spoken to them is that they feel that there's almost a sense that on all sides, from the kind of unionist and nationalist politicians and the British and Irish governments, that there's an attempt to kind of run down the clock because they know that it's seen as too controversial for the people who would have killed their loved ones to ever be prosecuted or to serve prison time now. But they also know that it's too controversial for them to kind of declare an open amnesty in a very overt way. So instead you have these kind of very long drawn out court cases that aren't given the proper resources, and where there isn't enough kind of impetus from the British and Irish governments to properly engage in those processes, and also those families feel really kind of lost, I think, within that system. And it's something that, as I say, we have these kind of debates oftentimes, that even in the media, on the BBC or in UTV, and people will be kind of talking about the kind of philosophical sense of what's happening, but that I think it's an incredibly distressing thing for lots of people just going through that. And we know that already there's incredibly high rates of kind of trauma in the north, including PTSD from within these communities. And I think a lot of people feel very, very badly let down by politicians on all sides, and at Stormont and in Oireachtas and in Westminster as well, because I don't think there is an appetite there to really deliver a mechanism to kind of give any genuine kind of solace or sense of justice for those families. But I think even if you look at within British politics, it would be seen as so controversial for men who are now quite elderly soldiers, former soldiers, to be prosecuted for crimes they would have committed during the conflict. It would be seen as too controversial, particularly among the kind of right-wing media in Britain. So that isn't going to happen. But at the same time, I think within Westminster, and particularly perhaps more among the Labour Party than there would have been from the Conservative Party, there's a certain anxiety around being so open about that and declaring an amnesty officially. So I think there's a deep sense of kind of people feeling quite abject and quite adrift, maybe just in terms of how that process doesn't really seem to be reaching any kind of managed conclusion. And it's very it was very challenging, just the personal impact for those families who are going, as I say, to court every single day, or going to their solicitor's office and trying bit by bit to try and get what they would consider to be justice, but feeling quite lost within that system at the moment.
Yeah. So thanks very much, Siobhán, for joining us this afternoon. It was really interesting insights. We covered like 360 degrees of all different things linked to Northern Ireland politics. I should say as well at the end, so this, our network, Island of Ireland Contemporary History and Politics Network, has lots of different events and videos which you'll be able to find on our website. We're sponsored by the GW4 who fund the project, which we're very much appreciative of. And just say again, thanks very much for Siobhán for joining us, and thanks for listening, and hope you join us for some of our other content soon. Thank you.